Imagine this. You're a 13-year-old boy, curled up on the cold stones of Rome, trying to sleep. Suddenly, you wake to find a pair of fine silk shoes right beside your face. A man is standing over you. He's clearly wealthy. The glitter of his rings alone could keep you fed for a year. In his hand, he holds out warm bread. You're starving, so you don't question his kindness. What you don't realize is that this stranger is Giovanni del Monte, a cardinal destined to rise higher than almost anyone in the church. What you don't know is that he's already had his eye on you. Just months later, you'll walk the marble halls of the papal palace. You'll be dressed in the red robes of a cardinal's companion. And soon, all of Europe will whisper your name, the boy the Pope could never part with. The bread smells like paradise, and your stomach twists with need. Yet the man's gaze makes you pause. You've survived Rome's streets long enough to recognize when someone has an interest in you. This time, the figure wears holy robes. But there's something unsettling in his eyes. You don't yet realize that taking his bread also means stepping into a bargain you never asked for. What feels like a rescue is, in truth, a snare. The promise of safety hides a price. This priest, so gentle in appearance, isn't simply offering charity. He's choosing. He has been watching you for weeks. He knows where you sleep. He's measured your hunger, your growing desperation. To him, you're exactly what he's looking for. Young enough to be shaped, striking enough to be noticed, and utterly alone. Alone enough that if you were to disappear, few would ask where you'd gone. Then the moment comes. A gloved hand rests on your shoulder. His voice is calm, steady. He tells you his name, Cardinal Del Monte. He says God has a purpose for you, a special purpose. What he doesn't tell you is that you're not the first. Others before you accepted bread and kind words, only to learn the cost too late. Some of those boys never returned from the palace. And those who did were never quite the same. Rome in 1550 was a city of splendor, but also of shadows. The streets overflowed with children left behind by plague and war. They begged for scraps. They stole to survive. They offered whatever small service they could, just to make it through another day. For wealthy men in their elegant robes, these children were the easiest targets. Easy to approach, easy to hide away, easy to control. The cruel truth was that the system worked because no one cared. Street children could vanish, and life in Rome went on as if nothing happened. Cardinal Del Monte understood this all too well. He had turned it into a routine. His servants combed the alleys each day, carrying food and coins as bait. And they weren't looking for just anyone. They had a pattern: boys between 12 and 16. The boys they chose often shared the same look, thin from hunger, faces too young to hide their hardship. But above all, the key was isolation. No family who might search. No friends to ask questions. No one who would notice when they disappeared. And you, unknowingly, fit every single requirement. His servants had been watching for months before they made their move. They knew the doorways where you slept, the scraps you fought for, even the shopkeepers who sometimes showed you pity. They studied your life the way scholars might study old manuscripts, documenting every detail. They even knew the name you'd nearly forgotten after years of surviving on the streets. They knew the nights when you wept quietly into the darkness, and the mornings when you secretly hoped the struggle would just end. But fate or timing made you stand out from the others. Pope Paul III had just died. The seat of St. Peter stood empty, and cardinals from across Europe flooded into Rome, each determined to claim the highest throne. Giovanni del Monte was among them, but there was a shadow over his path. His desires were no secret. Rumors whispered in Vatican corridors. If he wished to rise higher, he needed to wear the mask of holiness. He needed to appear untouchable. He needed someone who would make him look beyond suspicion. And that someone was you. His perfect disguise, wrapped in red silk. The papal election that followed was chaos. For 67 days, the cardinals were locked inside the Sistine Chapel, cut off from the outside world. The heat was stifling. Arguments broke out daily. Alliances shifted in whispers and notes passed behind fans. They bargained. They bribed. Some cardinals fainted from exhaustion. Others trembled with dread as the deadlock dragged on. But while his rivals wrestled over theology and politics, Giovanni del Monte stayed calm. He negotiated in quiet corners, made promises no one else dared to make. Slowly, he gathered just enough support. In the end, he convinced his peers he was the safe option, the man who posed no danger to their own ambitions. On February 7, 1550, the white smoke finally rose above the Sistine Chapel. Rome erupted with joy. Bells rang, crowds cheered. Children lined the streets, tossing flowers into the air. They had no idea what they were celebrating. The most powerful seat in Christianity had just been claimed by a man whose greatest gift was hiding who he truly was. And almost immediately, he turned his gaze back to you. What looked like an act of kindness was, in reality, the beginning of a carefully crafted plan. Your new life began that very day. The boy who once slept in alleyways was suddenly given chambers inside the papal palace. Your rags were replaced with silk garments worth a fortune. Servants hovered to meet your every need. Hot meals arrived at regular hours. Clean water was always within reach. But none of this came without a cost. The gifts carried invisible conditions, ones you had yet to understand. Their true weight would be revealed gradually, so slowly you couldn't resist when the truth unfolded. The transformation started in the bathhouse. It was your first real bath in years. Servants washed away the dirt of the streets with scented soaps. They clipped your nails, cut your hair, and treated old sores and infections. When you emerged, you hardly recognized yourself. Clean, refreshed, almost radiant. Prepared to be shown to important eyes, who would quietly judge if you were suited for roles you couldn't begin to imagine. Even the moments that looked like kindness carried hidden cruelty. The servants who bathed you were not gentle. They scrubbed until your skin stung. They inspected you as though you were an object to be judged rather than a child to be cared for. Every reaction, your silence, your fear, even the way you stood, was carefully noted and set aside for the Pope's review. If this already feels heavier than anything you remember from history class, you're right. The truth is often far darker than the polished stories in schoolbooks. Once the washing was done, the real transformation began: education. You were taught to read and write in Latin, to speak with elegance, to walk with poise, to bow with just the right measure of respect. Your teachers were priests chosen for their discretion. They understood their role was not simply to educate, but to prepare. They weren't shaping a scholar. They were shaping an ornament, a polished figure to be displayed before powerful guests. And the lessons had consequences. Each mistake carried punishment. A missed syllable in Latin, a stumble in posture, and wooden rods would strike your hands, sharp reminders to obey and improve. Forget a step in the bowing routine, and you'd be drilled for hours until your body ached. Show even the slightest hint of homesickness, and they'd remind you that your family had already left you behind, that no one cared for you anymore except the Holy Father. Gratitude, they said, was the only emotion you were allowed to feel. The transformation wasn't just in the mind. It was carefully crafted on the outside as well. Palace tailors measured every detail of your body, creating outfits that highlighted youth and purity. Clothes not meant to conceal, but to display. Barbers shaped your hair according to the latest trends. Servants smoothed rare oils across your skin. Slowly, you were sculpted into a living artwork, something created not for yourself, but for the desires of another. Yet, what cut deepest wasn't the outward change. It was the quiet, daily shaping of the mind. Each day, you were reminded of what your old life had been. Hunger, cold nights, loneliness, and the edge of survival on the streets. Your instructors never stopped praising the Pope's generosity. They called your new role a blessing, even a miracle. They insisted that countless others would give anything to be in your place. And so, any pain you felt was dismissed as ingratitude. Any questions became proof of doubt, and any hint of resistance was painted as defiance against God himself. They spoke often of the children still on the streets, sick, starving, left to die in alleys, that, they warned, would be your fate if you ever let the Holy Father down. They described in detail the punishments that awaited ungrateful boys. And beyond that, they painted vivid scenes of eternal fire for anyone who dared betray their saviors. Yet, as harsh as these warnings were, they weren't the darkest thing Cardinal Del Monte had planned. As the weeks went by, the lessons turned more personal. You were taught which wines the Pope enjoyed most, which dishes pleased his appetite, how to ease the tension in his shoulders, how to read his moods in the slightest shift of expression. You were trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make yourself indispensable, in ways that left you deeply uneasy. The line between servant and something more began to fade. And still, you were told this was natural. Not only natural, but sacred. You weren't alone in the palace. Other boys lived there as well. Most were older, more experienced, already shaped by the system. Their eyes carried stories you weren't yet able to read. They walked cautiously, avoided certain corridors at night, and flinched at the mention of certain names. If you tried to ask them directly, they would fall silent or change the subject. And yet, you could feel their gaze on you. Sometimes they looked at you with something between pity and dread, as if they were watching a lamb walk willingly toward a place it didn't understand. One boy, Marco, had been inside those walls for 3 long years. One evening, when the guard's attention drifted, he pulled you aside. Marco spoke in hushed tones about the Pope's special visits. At first, he explained, they seemed harmless. A hand resting lightly on your shoulder, gentle questions about whether you were comfortable, small gifts offered with hidden expectations. But slowly, they shifted into something else. Something that left not only marks on the body, but scars within the soul that never truly healed. He showed you proof on his own skin. Faint lines that once spelled out words, burns arranged with unsettling precision, bruises that seemed to linger far too long. Each mark was evidence of a system that cloaked abuse in the language of sacred affection. Then came the warning about a particular room in the papal apartments. A room with locks on the inside. A place, Marco said, where boys were taken, and where not everyone returned. The grooming always began quietly. The Pope would visit your quarters at night, always alone. He'd sit on the edge of your bed, speaking warmly about your progress, your studies, and the glorious future waiting for you in God's service. His hand would rest lightly, first on your shoulder, then sliding to your arm, and eventually your leg. All the while, he called you special, chosen, blessed by heaven itself. He claimed that God had led him to you, that your meeting was destiny. And with that came 3 rules: absolute trust, absolute obedience, and absolute silence about whatever happened between you. The first boundary crossed took place during a theology lesson. He was speaking about devotion, about how servants must surrender completely to their masters. His hand began on your shoulder, then moved lower and lower still. When you stiffened, he only smiled, assuring you this was how holy men expressed their care, how spiritual fathers blessed their sons. To strengthen his words, he even quoted scripture, verses about obedience, about honoring one's elders, about eternal rewards promised to the faithful. But the moment you resisted, his expression changed. The gentle priest disappeared, and something far more threatening emerged in his place. He reminded you of the life you had before his so-called kindness. But escape was never truly an option. Returning to the streets now meant carrying knowledge you were never meant to have. And in Rome, those who knew too many papal secrets rarely lived long. Rumors whispered of bodies pulled from the Tiber, silent warnings carved into the fate of others. So you learned to endure, to bend without breaking, to pretend. You forced yourself to act as though you welcomed the late-night visits, to produce sounds of compliance while fear clawed at your chest, to smile when your every instinct told you to cry out. And still, the Pope pressed further. Each week he became bolder, more demanding, more inventive in his rituals of control. He introduced instruments of devotion, as he called them, objects meant to test patience, restraints presented as spiritual lessons, methods designed to leave no visible trace while ensuring suffering lingered for days. In time, you realized the splendor around you was nothing but gilded walls of a prison. Guards shadowed your steps. Servants carried every word you spoke back to their masters. Even letters were intercepted and opened before you touched them. Your daily routine was scripted to the smallest detail, and even in prayer, your words were scrutinized for signs of rebellion or despair. You no longer belonged to yourself. You belonged entirely to Julius. Your body was his altar, your suffering his ritual, and the cruelty didn't remain the same. It escalated. What began as unwelcome touches soon became forced intimacy. What started as private encounters grew into something far worse. Performances staged for those Julius considered special guests. Powerful men, wealthy men, men who paid dearly to witness the Pope's hidden entertainments. Among them, high-ranking church officials who shared his appetites. Wealthy merchants poured their fortunes into church projects, not out of pure devotion, but because it gave them access to the church's hidden wealth and influence. And soon you discovered you weren't alone. Across Rome, others lived a similar fate. Boys kept close by bishops, young women concealed in convent walls, even children raised for no other reason than to serve this hidden system. The church wasn't dismantling the trade. It was shaping it, guarding it, even blessing it with holy words and sacred rituals. They wrapped it all in noble language, calling it charity, claiming it saved souls, insisting it gave the unworthy a chance to serve the worthy. Yet, behind the veil of sanctity, the very institution that promised to protect innocence was consuming it. An endless hunger cloaked in divine robes. And then came a moment so shocking that even high-ranking cardinals struggled to hide their discomfort. On May 31st, 1550, an announcement shook Europe to its core. Pope Julius declared his plan to elevate you to the rank of cardinal, a prince of the church, the youngest ever in its history. Diplomats were stunned. How could a boy from the streets, with no education, no training, and no credentials, suddenly be placed among the most powerful men in Christendom? The Vatican rushed to cover the scandal with tales of your supposed virtue, wisdom, heavenly visions, even miracles. But no one was convinced. Across Europe, rulers reacted with fury. The Holy Roman Emperor demanded answers. The King of France threatened to cut ties with Rome. The King of Spain recalled his ambassador in open protest. Even Protestant reformers, usually quick to condemn the papacy, were taken aback, not just by the decision itself, but by the sheer boldness of it. To many, this was evidence of every charge ever leveled against the Catholic Church. Corrupt, twisted, and decayed at its core. The Pope had lifted his young protégé into one of Christianity's highest ranks. The ceremony of your elevation unfolded inside the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo's great works looked on as you bowed before Julius. The same painted vault where God gave life to man now stood witness to a Pope-birthing scandal. Cardinals around you forced polite smiles. They followed the ritual steps, yet their unease showed through. Some would not even lay hands on you in the blessing. Others made excuses and slipped away early. To them, you embodied a parody of all they swore to uphold. And if you imagined the red hat meant true power, you were mistaken. That crimson headpiece carried heavy symbolism. Cardinals wore red as a vow that they would die for the faith. But on you, the robes spoke another truth. They marked you as the Pope's prize, his fragile captive, a living token that power tainted all it touched. From that day, you bore the name Cardinal Innocenzo del Monte. On paper, your new title gave sway over millions. In practice, you were still a wounded youth cornered by circumstance. By day, you sat in councils where decisions shaping the world were made. You cast votes on church policies that reached millions. You greeted envoys from powerful kingdoms. You laid blessings on pilgrims who had traveled for weeks just to feel your hand. All the while aware that everyone present knew the truth of who you really were. The disguise convinced no one, yet it had to go on. The image of the Pope demanded it. When night fell, the palace shifted. Julius would call you into his private chambers. The man who ruled Christendom by daylight became another figure entirely once darkness set in. He imposed demands that would have startled even the most jaded. He treated you in ways that left deep marks, wounds seen and unseen, that time could never erase. And still, there was no escape. You could not resist. You could not object. You could not even call for help, for every guard outside answered to him. Meanwhile, the other cardinals observed with a mixture of revulsion and calculation. Some were truly sickened. They had given their lives to serve the church, only to watch its sanctity diminished by papal indulgence. Yet others recognized advantage. If Julius could raise his own companion to holy office, what kind of precedent did that create? Soon, other favorites began appearing at court. Handsome youths of uncertain origin rose with sudden promotions, and the corruption spread quickly through the hierarchy. Pressure from abroad mounted with each passing day. Catholic rulers threatened open division. Protestant writers seized the moment, using the scandal as proof of Rome's decay. Inside the church, reformers demanded Julius be removed. Armies in several kingdoms prepared for the possibility of conflict. Yet the Pope remained unmoved. He clung to his own illusions, persuading himself that his attachment to you was holy, even ordained by God. It was a belief both dangerous and complete. Meanwhile, your own mind began to unravel. The boy once grateful for a crust of bread now lived in palaces yet felt more hollow than a crypt. You existed between two roles, publicly a cardinal, privately still a captive of circumstance. Neither identity felt real. Both demanded a constant act. The pressure etched itself into your face, your gestures, the vacant gaze that courtiers whispered about when they thought you couldn't hear. Letters you wrote to far-off relatives revealed glimpses of this torment. Though most were seized by palace spies, a few still survive in the Vatican archives today. In your letters, you described feeling like an actor trapped in a play with no script. You longed for the raw simplicity of street life, where at least pain was honest. You even admitted wondering if an end to life might be kinder than living in a cage of humiliation. In your dreams, you returned to doorways, but there, at least, you still owned yourself. Meanwhile, the great courts of Europe began plotting Julius' removal. A pope who had discarded all moral authority could not be allowed to remain. Secret talks took place between Catholic and Protestant rulers alike. Armies prepared. Assassination schemes multiplied. The scandal grew like a crack across Christendom, threatening to shatter the faith. Because one man's hunger had run unchecked, and because a starving boy had once accepted a piece of bread. Yet Julius carried on as if nothing loomed ahead. Instead, he dreamed of your future. He spoke of naming you as his successor, of founding a dynasty built on corruption and held together by force. He paid artists to paint you as a saint, poets to compose verses about your supposed wisdom, chroniclers to record tales of your visions. For him, image mattered more than truth. But what came next stunned even his closest allies. The breaking point arrived when Julius declared he would adopt you as his son and heir. This was not scandal, it was madness. Such a move would give you rights to papal lands and authority beyond the church itself. The boy who once begged for bread now stood to inherit sovereign states. At last, Europe realized they were facing a pope who had lost all sense of reality. The end came without warning. On March 23, 1555, Julius suddenly collapsed during Mass. Whispers of poison spread quickly, though nothing was ever proven. For 6 long days he lingered, calling for you again and again, begging forgiveness for sins he could not name, offering promises of salvation he could not deliver, weeping like a child who longed for his mother. And then he was gone. With his death, your shield of protection vanished into air. The new pope, Marcellus II, faced an impossible dilemma. He could not simply strip you of the red hat without undermining papal power itself. Yet leaving you in Rome risked endless scandal. Protestant writers across Europe were watching closely. So Marcellus devised a solution that was both clever and merciless. You were sent away to govern distant church lands, removed from Roman politics, hidden from curious eyes, far from the memory of your infamous rise. The exile was framed as a promotion, important duties in forgotten corners of Christendom. But the truth was clear. You were being erased, written out of church history like an unfortunate error. The boy who had once worn cardinal red was now disappearing into provincial obscurity, the place where scandals were left to wither. Life in those territories was harsh, even sobering. Local communities expected strong leadership, steady government, and spiritual wisdom from someone trained in theology. Instead, what they received was a 17-year-old with no training beyond papal favor and a fragile spirit. Your attempts at governing collapsed again and again. Your sermons became the subject of ridicule. Even unlettered peasants questioned your authority, sensing weakness behind the robes. You spent the rest of your years trying to grow into the role your title demanded, studying theology in desperation, learning administration through painful mistakes, chasing achievement to prove you belonged. You read every book within reach, hired tutors you could barely afford, and struggled to repair what had already been broken. But the harm could not be undone. Not to you, not to the church, not to Christianity's moral authority. Some wounds never heal. Witnesses describe your later years as marked by silence and sorrow, shadowed by memories you could not escape, dreams that woke you in terror, and waves of panic during ceremonies meant to display dignity. The boy who once believed he was being saved had instead been stripped down, reshaped, and left hollow. When you died in 1577, your passing stirred little notice, only a line in history books, as if the world preferred to forget. Yet your story has refused to disappear. It speaks to something far larger than one person's tragedy. The decay of power, the betrayal of innocence, the way institutions cloak corruption in sacred words and call it holy. These patterns return again and again, across nations and across centuries. The details may change, but the core remains constant. The powerful seek trust. The vulnerable are chosen for their weakness, and systems rise to defend their own instead of the ones they harm. This is the lesson hidden in your life, a reminder that history's darkest truths echo far beyond a single time or place.